You're listening to Nutrition Matters podcast with Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist. Nutrition Matters podcast explores how to approach food and your body in a whole new way. I interview people who share stories and expertise in rejecting diet culture, making peace with food, and discovering a more positive, realistic, and sustainable approach to health and well-being. I'm Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist, and owner of Positive Nutrition, an in-person nutrition therapy practice in Salt Lake City, Utah. I offer free resources, including this podcast, a blog, and posts on social media. If you're local to Salt Lake City, check out our services and availability for appointments, and keep your eyes out for in-person groups on mindfulness, intuitive eating, body image resilience, and more. Go to positive-nutrition.com and hit subscribe if you'd like to keep in touch. I also offer online courses covering topics like the science of nutrition, mindfulness, and healing your relationship with food. Check those out at positive-nutrition.com/academy. If you like what you hear on the podcast, you can make a difference by leaving a review, sharing with friends and family, or making a donation. Thank you so much for your support. You can also find me on Instagram or Facebook if you'd like to have a little more food for thought at Paige Smathers RD. Thank you so much for listening. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Nutrition Matters podcast. My name is Paige, and I'm your host. And this week, I'm switching it up, and I am sharing a little bit of a different type of podcast for you. So in this podcast episode, I'm sharing an interview where I was being interviewed by somebody else for their podcast. I wanted to share it for a couple reasons. First of all, I've gotten feedback that some of you as listeners have shared with me that you like it. You like kind of switching it up and hearing me as a guest. And so I thought I would just give you the opportunity to kind of hear how I like to answer some common questions I get about nutrition, about mindfulness, about self-compassion, about intuitive eating, etc. And then another reason I wanted to share this podcast episode is because my friend Rachel Goodman, who is the host of this podcast, it's a new podcast, so I thought I'd do my part, my small part, to try to help kind of spread the word about her great work that she's doing. Rachel is the host of the Kosher Intuitive Eater podcast, and I know that some of you might find that to be really appealing. Maybe that aligns with your religious practice, or maybe that just fascinates you from the level of being interested in religion and how it intersects with food and body image. And so if that's you, I highly recommend checking out her podcast. It's new, but I already know it's going to be really great. And then also, I think that so many of us have so much in common, even though we might maybe practice different religions or come from different parts of the world or whatever it might be. I think it's really cool to kind of see how similar we all are. So I thought I would kind of share this podcast with you to see if it might be a useful resource for you in your approach to food. And I just think Rachel's a wonderful human doing great work. So I wanted to do my part to kind of help share her new podcast. So as always, I just want to say thank you to all of you for being wonderful, supportive, amazing friends and listeners and clients and peers and colleagues, whoever you are. I appreciate you. I'm glad you're here. If you're new to the podcast, please stick around. Please continue to tune in and also check out previous episodes. In the podcast, we like to talk about how we can approach food in a realistic, sustainable, and positive way. I've done podcast episodes a lot with child feeding and with raising intuitive eaters, and also about particular nutrition topics that are fascinating to me and to others. Lots of recovery narratives and stories of folks who have worked through really significant and difficult issues with food and body image. I interview therapists, I interview other dietitians, I've interviewed physicians. So stay tuned, and I'm glad you're here, whether you're new to the podcast or old to the podcast. Thanks for being here. Thanks for your open minds and your support, your willingness to kind of come in and tune in regularly and be a part of this awesome project that I'm so grateful to be a part of myself. Just keep in mind, if you want to take things a little bit further with your approach to food, and if you're feeling like the podcast is helpful, but you want a little something more in depth, just remember I have online courses through the Positive Nutrition Academy. You can access those at positive-nutrition.com/academy. There's a course all about healing your relationship with food called Positive Nutrition for Life. There's a course all about the science of nutrition called Positive Nutrition 101. And then I do have a course about mindfulness and eating called the Mindful Eating Workshop, where I co-teach that with Noah Rasheta. That is also available there as well. If you'd like to get $25 off of that particular course, just enter in Nutrition Matters at checkout for the Mindful Eating Workshop. I also put on monthly webinars where you can join me live, or you can purchase the webinars in after they've already been recorded. That's also available through the Academy, through the Positive Nutrition Academy. I switch off doing one webinar for dietitians, worth continuing education credits, and then every other month I do a webinar for the lay public. This coming month, so the month of June 2019, putting on a webinar called the Positive Nutrition Approach to Meal Planning. This will be for the lay public. You can find more info about that at positive-nutrition.com/webinar. If you are listening to this after June 25th, which is the recording of the webinar, and you want to access the webinar, just go to the Academy website and you will be able to access it there. All right, with that, I just want to continue to say thank you, and I'm so excited to share this podcast episode with Rachel Goodman, where I am the guest on her awesome new podcast called The Kosher Intuitive Eater. All right, enjoy.
Hey guys, welcome to the Kosher Intuitive Eater podcast. I'm so excited to have our guest today, Paige Smathers. Paige is a nutrition therapist, podcaster, writer, and course instructor. As a nutrition therapist, Paige supports each client to find positive solutions to the questions and struggles they're experiencing with food and or body image. She helps clients find ways to learn to make peace with food and body in a weight-neutral, positive way. Paige specializes in practical, down-to-earth solutions for individuals in eating disorder recovery and those struggling with chronic dieting. She also enjoys helping families get into a comfortable groove with feeding dynamics and family meals. She works individually with clients, teaches multiple online courses, hosts the Nutrition Matters podcast, and owns Positive Nutrition. Hi, Paige. Welcome. I'm so excited to have you here.
Hi. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. I've been following you on Instagram for a long time, and I love the work that you do. And so I wanted to ask you, just to start with, how did you come to learn about intuitive eating, and how did you go about incorporating it into your practice? If you can share a little bit more about that process and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah. So I get asked that question a lot. That makes sense to kind of start there. And I always explain that I actually found intuitive eating fairly intuitively. And what I mean by that is before I had discovered the book, I discovered that later on in practice when I was working as a registered dietitian. But before that, going through school to learn about nutrition and to become a dietitian, that actually really helped me personally with my relationship with food. So learning about how dumb fad diets are and how they just don't work and how they're really not a good idea from a scientific perspective. And then also just being around a bunch of people. I was really lucky in my program. There were just a lot of people who just enjoyed food and who didn't really have huge issues with food. I mean, there were some here and there, but I kind of came to a lot of the principles of intuitive eating sort of on my own, just kind of exploring the science and then kind of witnessing others in my life have really healthy relationships with food. And then also when I met my husband, when we were dating, he was super helpful. He has this really positive, healthy kind of go with the flow relationship with food. And it was a very different approach to food than I did. And so because we were dating and I wanted to not be that kind of weird girl who was I kind of rolled with the punches with him. And I came around to kind of really realizing that his approach to food was a lot more realistic and positive for me. Mm-hmm. So then I started working as a dietitian. I worked in the inpatient clinical setting in the hospital for a couple of years, and then I started working as the outpatient dietitian. And once I got that role, they introduced me to the intuitive eating book, and it was so fascinating reading that book after sort of coming to a lot of those things on my own, I always felt like I was this rogue dietitian who was like, hey, don't worry so much about, this minute detail, zoom out. Let's just focus on approaching food in a healthy way. Like I would explain that stuff to my clients and patients. And I always thought, like, is this okay? Like, are other dietitians doing this? Like,
Right.
And then I found the book and I realized, oh, there is this whole world that I wasn't aware of. And there's all these studies and all this great research backing this up that continues to come out to this day. So that's kind of the short version of my story, was a lot of sort of just being a little bit introspective and just kind of learning as I go, and then realizing, wow, this is actually a thing.
Yeah. And it's pretty amazing that you like innately connected to that, and that it's actually the way it's supposed to be. But so much of the like external rules and what culture tells us makes us doubt what's already like right, that we already know innately, but we don't trust it because we have such loud voices around us. So that's pretty awesome that you did naturally connect to that, but then you had it validated with the intuitive eating book.
Yeah. And I never struggled with an eating disorder. So I know a lot of folks who are in our space have their own personal history with that. I mean, for me, it was, I actually did have a very positive role models in my life. So I think a lot of it was maybe a mixture of nature and nurture, and also just getting a good hand dealt to me genetically, in terms of like I didn't have a lot of predispositions for struggling in this way. So actually, because of that, I actually think that I'm somewhat of a different eating disorder clinician than a lot of others that I observe. Seems like I approach things just, I don't know, a little bit more just kind of chill sometimes than
I hear you.
You know what I'm saying? Like,
I think that's what makes you unique, though. Like when I read your post or any kind of content that you write, it's always in such a kind, compassionate way where wherever you are in your journey, someone who's reading it, they can connect to it, and it doesn't feel like it's to one extreme or the other. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I haven't found it to be very helpful and or very authentic to me to kind of come at it from like a really offensive angle. I noticed that people just put their walls right up.
Right.
They won't hear you even if you have a great thing to say. So a lot of the way that I communicate is informed by a lot of my practice in like learning about mindfulness and learning about myself, and kind of like what works when someone's trying to build a bridge with me. How am I able to listen to them? And I've done a lot of work in just sort of understanding myself so that I can understand other people better. And I think that that's been helpful. And not that I have this all figured out. Oh my gosh, far from that. But yeah, there's some elements of what I try to put out there that it's nice to hear it reflected back, like, oh, you don't come off super judgmental or mean, because that's definitely not what I'm trying to do. So
yeah, that would defeat the purpose because we're trying to like get people away from that to others and to themselves. So for sure. And you mentioned mindfulness. So I know you talk a lot about mindfulness. I know people who are listening to this, we're obviously talking about intuitive eating, but I find that the lines are a little blurred between mindfulness and intuitive eating. So can you explain, what is intuitive eating, what is mindfulness, and the differences, so people are more clear on what each one is, because it's not the same.
Yeah, it's not. And I see other people trying to explain the distinction, and sometimes I agree with them and sometimes I don't. So I'll throw out my opinion here, and I'm open to not being the end all be all person who says this is what it is. But so mindfulness is an ancient tradition that runs through so many different religious practices throughout history. I mean, I just learned a couple months ago that the Muslim tradition also has a very strong mindfulness like vein in it. That I didn't know that. I don't know about Judaism. Can you educate me on that? Is there like a mindfulness element that's part of it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think with anything that you have an intention on, right, in the way that you're living, you're having a mindfulness about it. So, any way that you practice, if you have an intention behind it, then you're applying mindfulness.
Yeah, awesome. So I have been like educated about mindfulness from like a Buddhist perspective, not from like a religious thing, but from like a secular place.
Yeah.
So to me, when I see people talk about mindful eating, it almost, unless it's certain people, like it almost feels like another diet, you know, where they're like, if you're mindful about your eating, then that means you're eating not very much and you're eating perfect balanced foods and you're eating blah, blah, blah. And so sometimes people think like, oh, if I use the word mindful, that's a more kind of digestible term than like, you know, going on a diet. But sometimes it kind of means the same thing. So we have to be really careful when we're talking about mindfulness as it relates to eating, that we're not like turning this beautiful concept that's like really like ancient, this practice that's just like been so positive for so many, and we're just like turning it into this one little element that kind of almost bastardizes the term. And I hope that's not too bad of a term to use here, but
no, that's, I think it's just, you're basically describing what it does to it. And it's like, it's such a beautiful thing, and it's so much more broad than just using it as monitoring your food intake.
Exactly. So mindful eating, I think, is like one tiny little way that you could practice mindfulness. But to me, mindfulness is this big kind of overarching sort of lens to view the world through. And it's rooted in understanding yourself and your thoughts and your intention, like you said, your why. Why are you doing the things you're doing, rather than just kind of taking things at face value and just like being robotic and doing whatever you're told to do, or whatever you're not told to do, just rebelling against that, or whatever it might be. You are actually becoming aware of yourself better, so that then you are able to more skillfully move throughout the world. So for me, mindfulness is it's a lens to view the world through. And some of the things that help me are to kind of get really clear about what type of life I want to live and what type of values I want to embody. In other words, how do I want people to feel when I'm around them? Like, what kinds of feelings or emotions do I want to evoke from others when they're around me? In terms of like, do I want people to feel listened to and appreciated and understood? Can I ask more questions than I try to give advice, type of thing? And so mindfulness for me is just a really kind of, it's a practice of trying to understand what my purpose is and what my values are, and how to connect to myself and others in a way that feels authentic and good and resonating with who I am as a human being. So, you know, food can have a role in that. We can sit down with a meal and we can consider, wow, what had to happen for this meal to be in front of me? Like, who sacrificed and who worked really hard and harvested these crops, and who like transported this food, and who went and shopped for it, and who cooked it and prepared it and put it in front of me. Like, I think that can definitely be in alignment with like religious practice for sure, but also it can be, it can be a mindfulness practice too. It doesn't need to be one or the other. It can just be like, let's take a minute to really think about all of the interdependence of life, including our food. And for me, what I love about that is it helps gratitude sort of arise from me naturally, rather than feeling like I have to sit down and be grateful. If I sit down and I look at my food through the lens of mindfulness, I'm automatically feeling like, wow, it's kind of a miracle that this food's in front of me right now.
That's beautiful. That's such a beautiful way to view life in general and your food. And it really takes away from, you know, it's just so much more than trying to eat less. I think a lot of times mindfulness, the end goal is just like, how can I be most mindful to how much I'm eating so that I don't eat more than this amount, which is, like you explained, it's so much more beyond that.
Exactly. So there's things that I have learned and come across and also learned about myself in kind of exploring this concept of mindfulness that helps me connect better to my food and to my body. And that's cool. But the thing about mindfulness that's really hard to wrap your head around. So if you hear me say this and you're like, she's loco, like, just if you have to kind of go into mindfulness practice with a non-striving mindset, meaning if you have an outcome, if you're trying to practice mindfulness to feel good, for example, it's not going to work. You can't do that. That's not what mindfulness is. It's not this clever trick, this mental trick that you trick your mind into being happy all the time or whatever.
feeling good might be a positive byproduct of practicing mindfulness, but it's not the reason you do it. You have to kind of not really have a goal. You have to recognize that the journey is the goal. So in that regard, you can see how that connects to food so well too, right? Like if we go into mindful eating with the goal of eating less, that's not really doing it, right? If you're going into consuming a meal and enjoying it mindfully for mindfulness sake and for recognizing like this meal is the goal, this journey is the goal. There's no outcome I'm doing this practice for. It's ironic, but that's often when you're able to kind of have some of these positive benefits of practicing it, but you can't really do it for that purpose. Does that make sense, or is that confusing?
That makes total sense. It sounds like you're saying just don't go in with an outcome, but fully connect to the present moment and let it give you whatever information that it holds. And you'll already get whatever outcome you're supposed to have without trying to force one.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So
I'm a mom of young kids, and forcing, just for me, like I've seen it so clearly in, raising little toddlers, forcing does not work for human beings. Like we're just not meant to.
I'm with you. Yeah. I have 2 girls too, like I told you before. And I'm so with you on that. But I want to know, so how does mindfulness apply to intuitive eating? Like what is intuitive eating, and how does mindfulness play a role in intuitive eating?
Yeah, for sure. So mindfulness, I think, can be sort of like an umbrella, like sort of lens to view your world through. And you might have different things that are important to you than are important to me, and someone else listening might have different things too. So I think intuitive eating is a framework. This is my opinion, okay? So intuitive
Go for it.
Framework to help you connect to your body better and to help you recognize that you are your own authority when it comes to your food and your nutrition. So if intuitive eating and the principles and the research and the writing of the book or the discussion online or the workbook, whatever, if you find that helpful in connecting to your body and honoring what it's telling you, awesome, great. But one of the big mistakes I see people make with intuitive eating is thinking of it like a checkbox where you're like, okay, I've rejected diet mentality, boom, done. All right, I'm honoring hunger, good, I'm going, I'm on the right track or whatever. I think that sometimes when we try to become an intuitive eater, like again, that same thing with mindfulness, if you're practicing intuitive eating to become something, I don't know if that's usually very effective for people. If you can just recognize like the journey of reading the intuitive eating book and working on it and practicing it, you can recognize that that's the goal. There is no like, this is what this looks like. And once you've arrived, you're done. And this is, it becomes easy or whatever. I think that principle, my understanding of mindfulness has helped me approach intuitive eating with a bit less of a like death grip, like this is the answer and this is what we have to do and everyone needs to look this exact way when it comes to practicing intuitive eating. This one of the big concepts in mindfulness is non-attachment, and that doesn't mean that things aren't important to you or you don't have goals or you don't have things you want to accomplish in your life, but it does mean that you kind of hold on to those things in a very sort of adaptive and skillful way where you say, okay, I want to work on intuitive eating, but I'm not going to hold so tightly to it that I forget to think about what's going to work for me as a human being in my own life. So for example, sometimes people think, all right, reject diet mentality. That means that I have to not eat anything that I ate when I was dieting. I can't even like ever order a salad ever again at a restaurant, or I can't ever eat broccoli ever again in my whole life.
Or cottage cheese. Sorry, I had to put that one there because I feel like cottage cheese is like the ultimate, like it's not a diet food, but it just becomes one for some reason.
Exactly. No, there's so many examples like that, right?
Yeah.
And so when we get really black and white and rigid about intuitive eating, we sometimes don't really find that piece that we're looking for. So I think we have to hold to intuitive eating kind of with this element of non-attachment so that we're able to like remember that what matters is this zoomed out big picture. Is this stuff working for me? Is what I'm doing working for me? And so I think mindfulness, at least in my experience, goes really well with intuitive eating. It helps us sort of look at some of the concepts we're exploring and some of the really emotional kind of big ideas that intuitive eating brings up, it helps us kind of do it in a way that's kind of big picture, helps you zoom out, helps you remember what's important to you, and really kind of gives you the permission to sort of explore concepts that maybe don't feel very like resonating with you right this minute. You have permission to explore those later. You don't need to think about intuitive eating like a checklist is what I'm trying to say.
So true.
So the distinction between intuitive eating and mindfulness, I would say, like the way that people describe it, for all intents and purposes, being mindful about your meals and your eating and your self-care practices can be kind of one and the same with intuitive eating. Like they really can. But mindfulness as a practice and intuitive eating as a practice are pretty separate and distinct concepts that can complement each other really well, but that both honestly can be boiled down to like the intuitive eating can be boiled down to the hunger and fullness diet, and mindful eating can sometimes be boiled down to like the healthy eating diet, right? So we have to be careful to not say, oh, I'm practicing this new diet, like it's just being mindful about what I'm eating. You have to recognize mindfulness is so much more than just eating, quote unquote, eating the perfect meal, which obviously we know doesn't exist too.
That makes sense. And I love that you mentioned how trying to like eat intuitively as like a checkbox and saying, okay, I did this, I did that, I have to honor hunger, fullness exactly, or anything like that, and trying to achieve what you think an intuitive eater should be, which there's no like, avatar to be like, you have to reach this to be an intuitive eater because it's going to look different for everybody. And I find that when I work with clients who have so many, when they start off, they struggle because they're trying to achieve like what they think is intuitive eating, and it turns it into a diet. And so I think when you view it through the lens of mindfulness, like you said, it's allowing yourself, from what I understand from what you're saying, is allowing yourself to experience things rather than using so much logic, but to connect to the moment as you work through the intuitive eating concepts with the tool and lens, like using mindfulness as a tool for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the end, all we have is each present moment. And so if mindfulness can help you practice living in that present moment, non-judgmentally, with curiosity, you're going to be able to engage in the principles of intuitive eating so much more skillfully, So
yeah.
I struggle to find lots of clear distinctions and to say, this is where mindfulness fits and this is where intuitive eating fits and these are how they're so different. I think in a lot of ways they are different, but in a lot of ways they really complement each other. And so I think that in a lot of cases, I don't know if I really think that we need to draw these huge distinctions. Like it's okay if they're just kind of like concepts that sort of mull around and help to inform your ability to connect with yourself better.
Yeah, for sure. I think we like to, as humans, just to compartmentalize things. And so like, this is mindful eating and this is intuitive eating, but things can kind of overlap and mesh and just, it not like, yes, logic is great, but not everything is logic and that's okay.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, like getting more comfortable with like the messy, nuanced gray area of like, I don't know, I'm still learning. I'm still figuring that out.
Yeah, I think it's a lifetime journey. I think as soon as you recognize that it's a lifetime journey, then you just drop all these like expectations and are okay with just making progress and learning rather than like this end destination or like this perfect way of eating.
Yeah. So one of the things I was going to say earlier that I just remembered was you were mentioning how it's so difficult for people to work through the idea of trying to eat intuitively on like a perfect level. Like, okay, this is what an intuitive eater does, so I'm going to do that. Especially when you're getting your education about intuitive eating on Instagram, let's just say, I feel like that can be a really confusing place for people because a lot of times it feels like, okay, so in order for me to be an intuitive eater, that means I have to just like always eat the perfect food that just totally hits the spot and is so delicious to me. And I can't ever eat something that like I'm kind of like meh about, like it's always got to hit the spot and I'm just going to always go out to eat or eat at 10 a.m. even though I just ate breakfast if I feel really hungry. I know that for me, I'm like, I have a schedule, I have a life, I pack a lunch when I go to work a lot of times. And so sometimes it's like, yeah, I don't really want to be eating this sandwich for lunch. I'd way rather be eating a burrito. But sometimes intuitive eating isn't what it looks like on social media. And so a lot of the work I do individually with my clients is kind of like undoing what they think intuitive eating is, because they're just seeing snapshots of people's life who are also, by the way, trying to sell them things, right? So anyway, it's a whole complicated mess sometimes.
I think Instagram in general, it's a good just to keep in mind that even if when we're being real, it's kind of like a filtered real. Like no one's being, and I think it's okay not to expect people to be super transparent. We're human when we have our own things going on. So we're just showing just a small snippet of things, and the things like, whatever it is with intuitive eating, the way it's presented. I love that you brought this up, because so many people won't even give it a chance or look into it. Cause like, oh, I know what intuitive eating is. It's like just eating cakes and cookies, like whenever you want, and I understand them viewing it that way, but I think it's just one of the principles that's most talked about, which is an important one. And it's the loudest because it's kind of with fighting one extreme with the other, but there's so much more to that. And so I'm so happy you brought that up, because Instagram, there's realness to it. I don't think it's like all fake, but it's not the full picture. So keeping that in mind, both with diet culture and I do think with intuitive eating, there's just always so much more than what you see in a picture. So Thanks for bringing that up.
You're so right. Some of the things that are easiest to show visually are some of those, like, I'm going to eat a donut, I'm eating ice cream, which is important for people to know that, that's okay, and to give some visibility to foods that have gotten a bad rap for so long. But you're right, it does kind of throw off the perspective of what people think intuitive eating is. And there is more to it.
Yeah, for sure. So, which is exactly why we're talking about it. So I'm so happy we talked about, difference between mindful eating and intuitive eating. And I want to get a little bit into, the compassion, self-compassion component in intuitive eating, because I know you talk a lot about that. So how does compassion play a role in intuitive eating, and how important do you think it is?
Okay, so self-compassion is such a fascinating topic, and the more I learn about it, the more I'm committed to just making self-compassion be this umbrella that all of the work that I do for nutrition, for eating disorder recovery, for recovering from chronic dieting, whoever I'm working with, if it's got to be under the lens or under the umbrella of self-compassion. There is so much incredible research being done about self-compassion. Just a quick sort of history, I don't know if history is the right word, but like just to kind of put it into context a little bit. As far as I understand, and I could be wrong, but as far as I understand, Dr. Kristen Neff was one of the first to kind of start looking at this concept of self-compassion. It was inspired and, inspired by her. Actually, she went to like a local like meditating group when she was in her doctorate program, and she was going through a lot in her life, and she heard this term self-compassion and started to be like, I wonder what that's about. And then she did her postdoc work with someone who specializes in the self-esteem sort of realm. So she had this really interesting juxtaposition of doing all this great work in her PhD about self-compassion, and then going into her postdoc, I don't know if it was a fellowship or what it was, but postdoc work with looking at self-esteem. And what's emerged is this really fascinating body of research, and others who are researching it too, where they're looking at this distinction between a lot of us, the way we were raised was to think, we wanted to have self-esteem. Our parents wanted to help us have self-esteem. And self-esteem sort of implies that I can feel good about myself as long as I'm the best, right?
I think that's such a complex so many of us have, for sure. Yeah.
Totally. Like, I'll own I'm working through it too, like, for sure.
Yeah.
Because my parents were so sweet, but they would say stuff like, you're the best, you're the most amazing, but really reinforce that, like, that was what was important about me. So this juxtaposition of these two terms, and a lot of us who are like, young parents kind of in our generation right now, were really raised in this environment of self-esteem. Everyone got a trophy and everyone was the best and everyone was awesome.
Yeah.
And so it's really fascinating to look at, there are benefits of self-esteem. However, it's impossible. Like, it's a logical implausibility that all of us can be the best at everything all the time, right? So the minute you feel good about yourself because you're the best, like, it only takes 1 minute to look around and realize I'm not the only one doing this. There's a lot of people doing it better. And then you go right back down to feeling like a total failure, right?
Yeah. And if we would all be the best, then there really wouldn't be anyone who's the best.
Exactly.
Like, we need to have people, more who are ahead of us in some aspects in life and behind us in some aspects in life, and like be okay with, as long as you're better than your version of you yesterday,
Absolutely. Yeah. So this idea of self-compassion does have benefits, but it also has a lot of risks. Whereas self-compassion has so many of the same benefits as self-esteem, but none of the risks, like none of the drawbacks of comparison is one of the big things that shoots off from self-esteem. Is in order for you to feel good about yourself, you have to constantly be vigilantly looking at those around you to decide where you fit in the pecking order. And I think that's like the root of so many of our issues with food and our bodies, is feeling like we need to be the best, whatever that even means or is. So if everyone's eating, pasta, and you're like, well, I'm eating a salad, so obviously like I'm great. That would be under that realm of like self-esteem stuff that kind of is weird and kind of messes with you. Meanwhile, you might come home from eating that salad and down like 15 cookies because, it didn't do it for you.
Right. And then you're not the best. Like, it goes to the opposite extreme where you're not the best anymore. Now your self-esteem in one swoop second is like gone in that moment.
Exactly. Like, 1 minute you feel good, the next you feel like a total failure. You're up and down, you're all over the place. Whereas self-compassion is saying, like, in a very kind of easy way to conceptualize it, it's just saying, all right, I've got my own back. Like, I'm treating myself like I would treat someone I really love and care about. And I'm going to just like come back to, it's okay. You're all right. You're doing good. Like, where do you want to go next? What's so cool about the research about self-compassion is that they're seeing that, especially in our world of, like all of this social media influence and all of these struggles with food and disordered eating and body image, self-compassion is emerging as this really, really protective factor against body image issues, against shame, against eating pathology even. So there's a meta-analysis that was done to look at, okay, what works for us in terms of like helping us to like be healthy and be happy. And one of the big things that emerged was self-compassion as a theme.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and all of the, anyway, all the issues with like being online and being exposed to all these images that can just be so triggering and so difficult to deal with. Like, I put out there a couple weeks ago on social media, like, if you're going to be on social media, you owe it to yourself to work on self-compassion. Because like you said, it's not bad. It's not bad to be on social media, but it can be really hard. And there are perils, there are dangers. And if you say, okay, like, when I close up that app and I go and live my life, I'm going to remember, like, I'm a good person. I'm doing the best I can. I've got my own back. I'm going to treat myself with kindness. If you can do that with yourself, if you're going to be on social media, you should do that for yourself.
100%.
With that.
For sure. And I love that you explained that distinction between self-esteem and self-compassion. Like, that was just a new way of looking at it for me. Because you don't think to like, I would think of it as, in order to have good self-esteem, you need to have, well, yeah, it's actually true. Like, you need to be self-compassionate in order to have good self-esteem. Mm-hmm. It starts with self-compassion, not the other way around.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
And kind of getting, like, really being mindful, again, this term mindfulness, but being aware and mindful of when thoughts of comparison pop in, and really starting to recognize and start to kind of gather some data. Like, when I'm around a bunch of women, do I notice that I'm looking around at everyone else's bodies and deciding where I fit in based on, am I the thinnest? Am I middle of the road? Whatever. If you're starting to do that, recognize that that's probably built off of some self-esteem stuff that's going on for you, and recognize you don't have to do that to feel good about yourself. You can actually practice self-compassion instead, and you don't need to do the whole ranking and comparing thing.
I love that. That's such a great, useful tool, especially with, I think, the journey in intuitive eating for a lot of people who have had that history of so much comparing, of feeling failure, and learning to eat intuitively is like a bumpy road. So to get through it to the other side where food is peaceful and, you're at peace with your body, you need such a heavy dose of self-compassion always, but especially I find as you work through learning to trust your body again.
Yeah, absolutely. And just recognizing like failing, quote unquote, failing is actually one of the best opportunities to learn more about yourself. And so self-compassion will help you learn what you need to learn when you feel like you're down and when you feel like you've fallen. If you can't practice self-compassion, you probably won't be able to learn from that experience. But as we're both moms of young kids, I remember watching my oldest daughter learn how to walk and seeing how many times she fell, and noticing how other parents a lot of times would just like walk behind their kids and make it so they never fell. And then at one point I came across this, I think it was a documentary talking about how if kids never fall, if kids don't fall while they're learning how to walk, they actually like will be developmentally like not as quick as kids who are able to fall. I could have this wrong, but I feel like I came across this at one point and it just really opened my eyes. Like falling is part of walking, like if you never fall, you never learn this skill. And so if we can remember that with ourselves, that helps us to move forward so much better. And in order to tap into that, we have to be compassionate with ourselves. We can't spiral into like, I'm a failure, I'm the worst, no one will ever love me. If you're doing that type of thing, you're not going to be able to access the learning opportunities in the things that appear to be failures.
For sure, 100%. Well, I mean, when you're not able to be self-compassionate, you miss out on the opportunity to learn. So, what would your advice or tips be for those who struggle with self-compassion, specifically when they're figuring out their eating habits and trying to learn to eat intuitively? How can they practice having more self-compassion if this is something that they struggle to cultivate?
Yeah, totally. So I think that mindfulness comes in really big here. And this is one element I didn't really explain about mindfulness, so I'll just do it now. Mindfulness, one of the ideas behind mindfulness is to free us from our habitual reactivity, which basically means all throughout our day, we have things that happen and we have ways that we respond. So stimulus and response. And mindfulness is saying, can we create a little bit of a gap in between the things that happen and the way that we respond? That doesn't need to be a gap every single time something happens, but when it's skillful, when it makes sense, when it works in your life, being able to kind of pull back and say, wait a minute, let me take a minute to kind of consider what's going on before I make a decision and how to respond. So when you are experiencing lots and lots of feelings and emotions and thoughts around failure with food or failure with intuitive eating, first of all, you don't even know that that's happening unless you are practicing a little bit of self-awareness and mindfulness, right? Because theoretically, you could have those thoughts, not even be aware of them, and be like habitually reacted to those thoughts all throughout your day, yelling at your kids and being mad at your neighbor and being a terrible dietitian with your clients or whatever, right? Mindfulness is saying when you notice those feelings arise in you or those thoughts, like just take a minute, just really try to understand what's going on internally and in your environment, and just take a minute to create a little bit of a gap. So I think self-compassion needs a little bit of that gap in order to kind of like work its way into our lives. So that's the reason I wanted to start with that explanation, is that we can't just say, okay, be self-compassionate unless there is some time for you to be compassionate, because theoretically you could just be so reactive that you don't even have time to work that into your day. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it sounds like you're saying use mindfulness, which is essentially awareness to your thoughts, to create that gap, so that once you create that gap, you could insert self-compassion.
Exactly. Yeah. So then the way that self-compassion can look in the moment, in the trenches of, oh my gosh, I just ate all the cookies and I'm so sick and I feel so gross and I'm the worst and I'm a failure. Okay. Self-compassion is saying, oh my gosh, I'm noticing these thoughts are coming up. Okay, let me just take a little pause here. Let me look at what's my life looked like up to this point. How long ago did I learn about rejecting diets and giving myself permission with food? What is the rest of, like, what's the context of where I am right here in this present moment? And then self-compassion can swoop in and you can say, well, that makes sense. I've struggled with this for a long time. This is a very new way of thinking. Of course, I have some ingrained kind of ways of behaving in my brain or in my behavior and in the way I think about things. And I just need to be gentle with myself. This is a process. And as long as I learn from this, I'll be okay. And I know I'm going to like fail, quote unquote, again. And it's all right. Like nobody needs to be perfect with this. If that can be your self-talk, even if it starts out with, oh no, I'm the worst, I'm a failure, I'm awful. You know, it's not, self-compassion is not saying you can't ever think that or you can't ever have those thoughts, because you will. We all do.
You're human.
Exactly. But self-compassion can kind of say, well, wait a minute, that makes sense. It's okay. I can learn from this. It's very similar to what you would say if your friend said, oh, I ate all the cookies, I'm a total failure, I'm the worst, no one will ever love me. You know, you wouldn't be like, oh yeah, you're totally right, you're awful, like I hate you.
That is not a good friend, no.
Your friend would say exactly what I just said. And so if we can start treating ourselves a little bit more like that, that's self-compassion. And by the way, one of the big barriers to self-compassion is thinking, well, if I'm just like kind to myself, like, am I just going to be so out of control? And am I always going to be just making excuses for bad behavior, blah, blah, blah. There's really like legitimate concerns that come up. And what the research suggests is we actually eat better, care for ourselves better, exercise like more, and not like to a unhealthy level, but just in terms of we exercise more appropriately. We do all of these self-care behaviors more appropriately when we are engaging in self-compassion than when we are engaging in lots of self-defeating thoughts. So if the goal of working on intuitive eating is to try to really work on your health and your well-being and to try to really figure out how to care for yourself well, self-compassion is going to help you get there. Self-loathing is not. So that's one thing that I always like to explain too, is it's actually really health promoting behavior.
I love that a lot of it is intuitive and like you see it in your own life, but that there's actual research to show that as well. It's just so amazing. And I think just this whole conversation with self-compassion and mindfulness at the same time is just so great to pair the two together, like you explained, where you first need to be mindful to your situation to then apply self-compassion. It's almost like sounds like a two-step process. And that self-compassion really is like almost the foundation, like building blocks to eat intuitively, because the whole intention behind intuitive eating is about self-care. Yeah. And so you're going to want to care for yourself when you're kind and compassionate to yourself. So it really does start there.
And I think even one layer deeper, and the reason mindfulness is so cool is mindfulness is what helps you get to know yourself well enough to really feel like you are deserving of care and compassion, right? So a lot of us kind of don't really know who we are. We're so reactive that we don't even really take time to get to know ourselves. And I know that might sound so corny, but
it makes so much sense. I'm relating so hard right now. Like it makes so much sense. There's so much about ourselves that we think we know, and we don't even we're so many layers deep, and we don't take the time to discover that.
Exactly. So I mean, now that we're talking this through, I'm always learning. So like, to me, like I loved your analogy of the foundation of self-compassion and maybe how mindfulness and self-compassion can kind of be, kind of lead to each other. So like maybe mindfulness is first and then self-compassion and then intuitive eating. Like I can see that being
like the pyramid. Ooh, I like that.
Because here's the deal. And here's a big issue people run into with intuitive eating is not coming to it with this perspective of I matter, I'm worthy of care. You know, like they're coming at it from, I want to change my body. I hate myself. I'm the worst. And that is really, really hard to trust your cues of hunger and fullness and satisfaction and enjoyment and all that stuff. It's really hard to do that if you're not coming from this place of, wait a minute, I matter, you know?
Yeah. Absolutely, 100%. I'm so happy that we had this conversation. I think it's going to be so helpful to listeners who are in that place right now of like wanting to learn to eat intuitively, but struggling in where to start, or maybe they've kind of started figuring it out, but like are stuck because they're not practicing more self-compassion or mindfulness. So this has been a great conversation, Paige. Thank you so much for all your insights and wisdom. I've learned a lot as well, especially with the distinction between self-esteem and self-compassion. I thought that was super interesting and fascinating. So where can listeners find you to learn more?
Yeah, so my website is positive-nutrition.com. And I'm on social media, mostly just on Instagram and Facebook, but my handle there is Paige Smathers RD. And you can find my podcast and my blog and my courses and webinars all on the website as well.
Amazing. And I'll also put the links to all of those for anyone who wants to check it out. Paige also has a podcast, Nutrition Matters, and a lot of other resources you can check. Thank you so much for being on here, Paige. It's been a pleasure having you.
Well, thank you for having me, and thanks for all your kind words. This was a really great conversation. I learned a lot too.
Awesome. I'll see you. Bye.
Bye.
Well, I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this conversation. If you haven't already, please go ahead and leave a review on iTunes. Thanks again so much for listening, and we'll see you soon for another episode.